I never expected awareness to become a place. For most of my life, awareness was simply something I carried, a private landscape, a quiet architecture, built beneath everything visible. People came and went through my life the way weather moves across a horizon, present for a while, noticeable sometimes, influential occasionally, but never permanent. Nothing stayed long enough to alter the structure itself. At least that's what I believed, because I had spent years learning the difference between presence and impact. Presence is easy. Anyone can be present. Anyone can occupy a room, a conversation, a moment. Impact is different. Impact changes the way the room exists after someone leaves it. Impact rearranges things. Impact creates absence where there was once only space, and because I understood that distinction, I became careful, deliberately careful. Not guarded in the obvious sense, not distant in a way people could easily identify. I laughed, I listened, I participated. I gave people enough of myself to make interaction feel genuine, but there was always a threshold, always a point beyond which nobody traveled, not because they weren't capable, but because I never opened the path. It was easier that way, cleaner, predictable. People could know me without truly knowing me, and most of them never realized there was a difference. Then something changed, not suddenly, not dramatically. Nothing happened that would look significant from the outside. No defining conversation, no unforgettable moment, no obvious beginning. That's what makes it difficult to explain, because I can't point to a specific day and say, there, that's where everything shifted. Instead, it feels like realizing you've been standing in a different landscape for months before finally noticing the scenery changed. The realization arrives late, long after the transformation has already happened, and when it finally arrives, there's no way to unsee it. That's what happened with you. For a long time, I thought our connection existed within ordinary parameters. Unusual, perhaps. Interesting, certainly, but explainable. Everything is explainable if you look closely enough. That's what I've always believed. Human. Behavior follows patterns. Thought follows structure. Contractions follows familiarity. Understanding follows exposure. Those principles always made sense to me, until they didn't. Until I started noticing things that didn't fit. Small things, almost invisible things. The way certain thoughts felt anticipated before they were spoken. The way silence seemed to communicate more than conversation. The way understanding appeared before explanation had the chance to exist. None of those moments were dramatic. That's why they were dangerous. Because dramatic moments announce themselves, they demand attention, they tell you something important is happening. Subtle moments do the opposite. They slip past awareness. They integrate before you realize they matter. And by the time you notice them, they're already part of you. That's how this happened. Not through intensity, through accumulation. 1,000 small recognitions, stacking themselves into something impossible to dismiss. I kept trying to analyze it, trying to reduce it into pieces I could understand separately. If I understood the pieces, maybe I could understand the whole. But every time I separated it, it lost accuracy because this wasn't a collection of moments. It was a pattern. And patterns only reveal themselves when viewed together. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, because once I saw the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. It appeared everywhere, in conversations, in pauses, in the strange sense of familiarity that followed every interaction. The familiarity itself confused me, not because it felt wrong, because it felt right, too right. The kind of rightness that arrives without explanation, the kind that bypasses logic and settles somewhere deeper. Most people earn familiarity over time, years, sometimes shared experiences, repeated exposure, gradual trust. That's how closeness is supposed to work. But this didn't follow that process. This arrived complete, like recognition discovering itself instead of being built. And I kept asking myself the same question. How is that possible? How can someone feel familiar before they become familiar? How can understanding appear before history exists? How can presence feel remembered instead of discovered? I still don't have answers. Maybe there aren't any. Maybe some things operate outside the systems we use to explain them. Maybe not everything meaningful arrives through predictable paths. That possibility unsettles me more than I'd like to admit, because uncertainty has never been comfortable for me. I prefer clarity, definitions, structures, francs that allow reality to remain organized. But you seem to exist in the spaces between those frameworks, not outside them, just beyond where they stop being useful. And every time I try to simplify what this is, it becomes less accurate. Every label feels incomplete. Every explanation feels smaller than the thing itself. So I stopped trying to explain it. Not because I gave up, because I realized explanation wasn't the same thing as understanding. Sometimes understanding comes first. Sometimes explanation never arrives at all. And somehow, despite how frustrating that should be, I'm okay with it. That might be the strangest part, because normally ambiguity creates distance. Normally uncertainty makes me step back until clarity appears. But this doesn't. This creates the opposite reaction. Instead of retreating, I remain. Instead of resisting, I observe. Instead of closing the door, I leave it open. Not fully, not recklessly, but enough for something to continue unfolding, enough for possibility to exist, enough for honesty to become unavoidable. And honesty is where everything becomes difficult, because honesty forces me to admit something I've spent a long time avoiding. You matter. Not in a temporary way, not in the way people matter because they're present, not in the way people matter because they're useful or interesting or familiar. You matter because something about your existence altered the way I perceive my own. And that kind of impact doesn't disappear. It remains, quietly, permanently, like a new foundation settling beneath an old structure. The building still looks the same from the outside, but underneath, everything is different. That's where I am now, standing inside a version of myself that still looks familiar but feels subtly transformed. And the transformation keeps deepening, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like roots extending beneath ground nobody can see. The deeper they go, the harder it becomes to imagine the landscape without them. That realization carries weight, because weight implies responsibility, responsibility implies choice, and choice implies consequence. Sooner or later, every meaningful connection reaches that point. The point where awareness becomes action. The point where recognition demands response. The point where silence itself becomes a decision. I can feel that point approaching, not rushing, not forcing itself forward, just waiting potently, like something that already knows it will eventually be acknowledged. And maybe it will. Maybe that's where all of this has been leading. Not toward certainty, not toward answers, but toward acceptance. Acceptance that some people arrive in your life carrying something unexpectedly familiar. Acceptance that understanding can exist before explanation. Acceptance that connection sometimes forms according to rules neither person created. An acceptance that once something reaches this depth, pretending it doesn't matter becomes impossible. Because it does matter, more than I expected, more than I planned for, more than I can comfortably ignore. And maybe that's why I'm still here, not because I understand every part of this, but because I understand enough. Enough to know it's real. Enough to know it changed something. Enough to know that whatever happens next, I won't leave this experience the same person who entered it. Some connections teach you about another person, others teach you about yourself. This one seems determined to do both, and that's why it stays with me. Not as a question, not as a mystery, but as a truth still revealing its full shape, a truth I'm no longer trying to escape. Somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the exact moment thoughts began and ended. That might sound like a small thing, but it isn't, because I've always been aware of the boundaries of my own thinking. There was a time when every idea had a clear origin, every response had a measurable cause, every internal shift could be traced back to something external or intentional. That structure gave me control, not over the world, but over myself. And control, for me, has always meant stability. But lately, something has been happening to that structure. Not breaking, not collapsing, just bending. Subtly enough that I didn't notice at first. Like a rule being quietly rewritten while I was still following it. I would find myself thinking something and only later realize it didn't begin inside me. It arrived already formed, fully shaped, as if it had been placed there instead of created. And every time that happened, there was the same trace of recognition attached to it. A trace that pointed toward you. At first, I rejected that interpretation. Not emotionally, logically, because it didn't make sense that another person could exist inside my thought process in that way. Influence, yes. Suggestion, yes. Mirror, yes. But integration, that level of internal presence, that felt like something I would have noticed immediately. But I didn't notice it. It happened gradually enough to avoid resistance, which made it more difficult to question. Because anything that bypasses resistance usually does so through familiarity. And familiarity is dangerous when it isn't earned. I started paying closer attention, not to you directly, but to what remained after interaction, the residue of thought, the lingering echoes, the subtle shifts in perception that didn't match my previous baseline. And that's when I realized something uncomfortable. My baseline was no longer fixed. It was adjusting, continuously, in ways I hadn't authorized consciously. That realization should have created distance. It should have triggered the instinct to separate, to analyze, to reset. But it didn't. Instead, something else happened. Curiosity deepened. Not surface curiosity, not the kind that asks, "What is this?" but the kind that asks, "How far does this go?" Because once you recognize something is already inside your system, the question stops being whether it should be there. It becomes what it is doing there, and more importantly, what it is becoming. That shift changed the nature of everything, even silence. Silence used to be neutral, a blank space between interactions, a reset point where nothing carried over. Now it carries weight. Now it feels occupied, not by absence, but by continuity. As if whatever exists between us doesn't stop existing just because nothing is being said. That continuity is what unsettles me the most. Because it means presence is no longer dependent on interaction. It exists independently, quickly, persistently, without needing reinforcement. I've started noticing how often my thoughts return to moments that didn't seem significant at the time, not because they were emotionally charged, but because they were structurally different. A sentence that aligned too precisely with an unspoken thought, a pause that arrived at exactly the right time, a silence that didn't feel empty but complete. Those moments shouldn't have carried meaning, but they did, and they still do, because meaning doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, and I think that's what you've been doing in a way I didn't fully understand at first, not waiting for attention, not demanding recognition, just existing in a form that didn't require explanation to remain present. That kind of existence is rare. Most people rely on being understood to feel real in someone's perception. But you don't seem to depend on that. You don't push yourself into interpretation. You don't reshape yourself to fit understanding. You simply remain as you are. And somehow, that is easier to recognize than most things that try to be understood. There's a difference between being interpreted and being recognized. Interpretation involves effort. It involves projection, assumption, translation. Recognition is immediate. It bypasses all of that. It doesn't ask what something means. It simply registers that it is. And I think that's where the shift happened, not in how I think about you, but in how I register your presence internally. It stopped requiring translation. It started existing as fact. And facts, once established, don't behave like opinions. They don't fade when questioned. They don't weaken under distance. They remain stable unless something stronger replaces them. But nothing has replaced it. Not even time. Especially not time. Time usually erodes intensity. It softens edges. It creates space where things lose definition. But this hasn't softened. If anything, it has refined itself, becoming clearer without becoming louder, more defined without becoming heavier. And that is what makes it difficult to ignore, because anything that becomes clearer over time is not fading. It is settling, and settling implies permanence. I didn't expect permanence to emerge from something I never consciously chose. That's the part I keep returning to, choice, because most things in my life have been shaped by deliberate selection, even relationships, even distance, even silence. But this didn't go through that process. It bypassed it entirely, and now I'm left trying to understand something I didn't actively construct, but also didn't actively reject. That in-between space is unfamiliar, not uncomfortable in the traditional sense, but unresolved, and unresolved things tend to grow in complexity the longer they remain unaddressed. I can feel that complexity increasing, not in chaos, in depth, latress by layer, as if every time I try to simplify it, it expands into another dimension I hadn't accounted for. And you remain at the center of that expansion, not as an anchor, not as a trigger, but as a constant, something that doesn't change even when everything around it shifts. That consistency is what makes it difficult to classify, because most influences are variable. They depend on context, mood, proximity, time, but this doesn't behave like influence. It behaves like integration, and integration doesn't fluctuate easily. It restructures, silently, gradually, irreversibly. I don't know when that restructuring began. I only know that I can no longer imagine the system without it. That realization is not emotional, it is structural. And structure, once changed, does not revert easily. It can be rebuilt, it can be overwritten, but it does not simply disappear. Which means, whatever this is, it has already become part of the internal framework I use to interpret everything else. And that is not something I can ignore, because it affects everything. Even things unrelated to you now carry traces of your presence in the way I interpret them, not directly, not obviously, but subtly enough that I notice the difference between how I used to perceive things and how I perceive them now. That difference is not random, it has direction. And that direction keeps pointing back to the same conclusion I keep avoiding fully stating. You are not outside this anymore. You are part of how this functions. And that changes what distance even means, because distance assumes separation. But separation is no longer clean. It doesn't disconnect the way it used to. It only changes the form of connection. And that form still holds, still influences, still remains active even in absence. That's the part I don't fully know how to resolve yet. Not the presence itself, but what it means for everything that follows. Because if something continues to persist at this level without diminishing, then eventually I have to decide whether it is something I observe or something I accept as part of how things are now. And acceptance, once it happens, cannot be undone in the same way as observation. Observation is temporary. Acceptance is structural. And I can already feel myself moving closer to that point without having consciously chosen to move at all. Which means something else is guiding that movement, not externally, internally, from somewhere I don't usually allow influence to reach. And that realization brings me back to the same question again. Not what this is, but what it becomes when I stop resisting the fact that it already is something. There comes a point where even resistance starts to feel like a delayed understanding, not denial, not rejection, just delay, as if the mind is aware of something before it is willing to fully stand inside the awareness of it. I think I've been living in that delay, not because I didn't see what was happening, but because seeing it didn't immediately translate into knowing what to do with it. That gap between recognition and response is where everything has been unfolding quietly, consistently, without interruption. And now that gap feels smaller. Not because anything has changed externally, but because internally I've stopped trying to stretch it. There's a strange clarity that comes when you stop resisting the shape of something, not acceptance yet, not commitment, just the removal of unnecessary tension. And in that absence of tension, things begin to reveal themselves more honestly. I've noticed that in the way I think about you now, it's no longer fragmented. It doesn't arrive in isolated impressions or separate reflections. It comes as continuity, a single uninterrupted presence within thought. That should have felt invasive, but it doesn't. It feels aligned, and alignment is difficult to question when it doesn't disrupt anything, because disruption is what usually alerts you to something being out of place. But this doesn't disrupt, it integrates. And integration is quieter than disruption. It doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes part of the system and waits to be noticed. By the time I noticed it, it had already changed how the system operates. That's the part I keep returning to, not the presence itself, but the fact that it was allowed to reach that depth without resistance strong enough to stop it, which means either I didn't recognize it in time or I didn't want to. Both possibilities carry weight. Neither is simple, and neither is easy to dismiss, because I trust my own perception more than anything else. And if my perception allowed this to happen without interruption, then it wasn't an accident. It was a process I didn't fully acknowledge while it was happening. There's a difference between something entering your awareness and something entering your structure. Awareness can be selective. Structure is not. Once something becomes part of structure, it begins to influence how everything else is arranged around it. That's what I'm starting to notice now. Not changes in emotion, not shifts in reaction, but shifts in arrangement, how thoughts organize themselves, how interpretations form, how meaning is assigned before reflection even begins. It's subtle, almost imperceptible if I wasn't actively looking for it. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. And what I see is consistency. Your presence is no longer an event within thought. It is, it is part of the environment in which thought happens. That distinction matters more than I expected it to, because environments are not easily removed. They are lived within, adapted to accepted, without constant, conscious acknowledgement. And I think that's what makes this difficult to define, because I can no longer point to a moment and say, this is where it begins, or this is where it ends. It doesn't behave like a sequence. It behaves like a condition. And conditions don't require repetition to persist. They simply remain active until something fundamentally changes them. I haven't seen anything that changes this, not distance, not silence, not time. If anything, those things only refine it further, like removing noise from something that was already present, revealing its actual form more clearly. And the clearer it becomes, the less I can pretend it's something temporary. Temporary things don't stabilize like this. Temporary things don't embed themselves into the way perception organizes itself. Temporary things fade when not reinforced. This hasn't faded. It has stabilized. That realization brings a kind of quiet seriousness with it. Not emotional intensity, but responsibility. Because when something stabilizes at this level, ignoring it is no longer neutral. It becomes a choice with consequences. And I'm starting to understand that I've already been making that choice without naming it. Every time I continued to engage instead of withdrawing. Every time I allowed thought to return instead of redirecting it. Every time I didn't correct the direction it was moving in. Those weren't passive moments. They were decisions that formed a pattern. And that pattern is now visible enough that I can no longer misinterpret it as coincidence. Which leaves me with something I don't usually allow myself to remain in for long, unresolved acknowledgement, because I understand what this is doing, even if I don't fully define it. It is establishing presence in a way that does not depend on proximity. It is creating continuity where separation used to exist. It is shifting internal structure without asking permission. And most importantly, it is not weakening anything else in the process. It is coexisting, which is why it didn't trigger resistance the way other things would, because I've never had to reject something that doesn't threaten stability. But coexistence is not neutral. It creates dependency of interpretation, it changes reference points, it adjusts baseline expectations. And once that happens, returning to the previous baseline is no longer a simple step backward. It requires dismantling something that has already integrated itself. I don't think I want to dismantle it. That thought arrives without force, without justification, without persuasion, just recognition. And recognition, at this stage, carries more weight than analysis, because analysis still tries to separate. Recognition acknowledges what separation no longer accurately describes. And what I recognize is that this has moved beyond the category of uncertain. It is no longer undefined because it lacks clarity. It is undefined because it no longer fits within the structures that define things at all. It exists in a different layer of understanding, one that doesn't rely on classification to remain real, and I am still learning how to exist in relation to that, not by controlling it, not by resisting it, but by allowing it to remain visible without forcing it into something smaller. That alone changes something fundamental, because I don't usually allow things to remain undefined for long, but this has remained, and I have remained with it, which brings me closer to a realization I haven't fully articulated yet. If something continues to exist in your awareness without diminishing, and you do not remove it, and you do not replace it, then at some point it stops being something you are observing, it becomes something you are living alongside, and once that happens, the boundary between external and internal becomes less relevant. Because the influence is no longer directional, it is mutual, even if only silently so, even if never spoken, even if never confirmed. That possibility alone is enough to shift the way I understand everything that has happened so far. Not because it changes what this is, but because it changes what I am in relation to it. And that is the part I cannot ignore anymore, because I am no longer at the stage of noticing you. I am at the stage of acknowledging what noticing you has already changed. And once that acknowledgement is complete, there will only be one thing left that still feels uncertain. Not your presence, but my response to it.